Welcome to the Ave Goddess podcast with spiritual detective Dr. Joanna Kujawa and its motto, if you want to be spiritual, ask difficult questions. In this podcast, we discuss Mary Magdalene, the archetypes of the Ave Goddess, new forms of consciousness they inspire, as well as the interconnection between sexuality and spirituality. You can join the conversation by signing to the Ave Goddess podcast, my YouTube channel, Dr. Joanna Kujawa, or even better, through my book, The Ave Goddess, Mary Magdalene and the Goddesses of Eros and Secret Knowledge, published by Sacred Stories. And today we'll have a fascinating conversation with Joan Taylor, scholar and author of 3 books. Am I right? 3 books?
Well, more than 3 books, yes.
Okay, more than
Several
3 books, but I am aware 7.
I can't remember how many books, maybe 7, yeah.
7, because I'm aware only of 3. And I read and loved one of your books, Jewish Women-Philosophers in First Century Alexandria, which I used in my own book, especially the typology of this book. And, I must say that first century, second century, actually first century to the 4th century is my absolute favorite time in human history. And, Alexandria is the place that I believe I was supposed to be born in, in the 1st century. So when I read your book, I really felt that you were my soul sister or intellectual sister. And in a way, you walked the path that I chose not to take when I decided to take a more alternative path, as a scholar. So I'm just so excited, that we can have this conversation. So
thank you for having me. It's really great to have a conversation with you.
My pleasure, my absolute pleasure. So first question that I would like to ask you is, how did you find yourself on this scholarly journey, and also how you got interested in women philosophers, especially 1st century, but even early, because in your book, the one that I read, you mentioned other philosophers from ancient Greece especially, and also 1st century early Christian history and women in that history, which is a fascinating topic by itself.
Well, it's a long story, really. When I first had my first job at Waikato University in New Zealand, returned to New Zealand after my PhD overseas, arriving as a woman in the Department of Religious Studies there, the Religious Studies program, the convener of the program said, well, look, there's a lot of interest in women's studies. Could you teach courses on women in religion? And I also worked not only in religious studies, but also as an ancient historian in the history department. And they also wanted me to, as a woman, teach on ancient women. And so I hadn't particularly focused on women before that. But I was then thrown into the topic of women through teaching. And of course, now when you think about it, it's ridiculous. It's just because you are a woman, you can teach women's history. But that was the mood in the 1990s. And it was a very big topic at Waikato. There was a Women and Gender Studies program at that time. It was just very live in the 1990s. So I started to teach these modules, these 2 modules, and just really got absolutely fascinated. And it was good for me to be thrown into ancient history, the classics, as well as Christian history. I think that's something that's really helpful because I had done my studies in Christian archaeology, Christian history as part of my PhD, and sort of dipped into the wider world of the wider ancient world, both East and West. But it was through teaching ancient women, women in the Greco-Roman world, that I then got to grips with the classics, and that enabled me to create this more of this classical background for looking at early Judaism and Christianity, which I think is really vital because early Judaism and Christianity arrive in this cultural context, which is the Greco-Roman world. and everything that we have in terms of our texts needs to be seen through that cultural context.
That's right, and I couldn't agree with you. And I remember when I was at the Pontifical Institute, one of my professors, it was best intellectual experience for me. One of the professors said, now we live in the paradigm of science, but people, from in the first century and earlier, they really lived in a completely different paradigm, and especially, early Christian era and so on, it was heavily influenced by Plotinus and Neoplatonism. So you couldn't really, right? You couldn't really look at this era, without it. I was talking about the fourth century then. So, and the same, through the classics. So would you call yourself primarily classicist, or?
I'm an ancient historian. I'm a historian of religion. And so I'm interested in religion and philosophy within the Greco-Roman world, within Judaism, with Christianity, and looking them at these holistically enables better understanding of how things go the way they go, in terms of, particularly in terms of women and gender, because when you've got this radical, you've got radical elements in both Judaism and Christianity, but they hit the incredible conservative models of thinking that had been traditional in the Greco-Roman world, and patterns of thinking about what is appropriate for women in a very male-dominated society. So they have to accommodate to these patterns.
That's right. So it's really kind of sad when I think about it, because every interesting thought and movement, intellectual movement, is within a particular cultural context, and in the past very often this context was not very friendly towards women, right? But when you speak about radical elements in Judaism and Christianity, would you like to briefly elaborate what you mean by that?
Well, just to go back to the book, the book that we're mainly going to be talking about is Jewish Women-Philosophers. In first century Alexandria, Philo's Therapeutai Reconsidered, which came out in 2003, which was really the product of my work in the 1990s, and then, finally putting it all together in 2002. Largely, I had a year at Harvard Divinity School, which was really profitable for me as visiting research associate, and had taught a module on women in nascent Christianity.
Fantastic.
And what I had thought was I was going to write, in fact, a three-way study, which would be looking at the Therapeutai, these women who were described by Philo of Alexandria as living outside Alexandria and being philosophers within the Jewish tradition, and therefore very radical in terms of gender.
Yes.
And I would compare that with what was going on in Greco-Roman philosophy at the time, and I would then compare these two with what was going on in Christianity as well. And so I would have this triangle of comparisons, incredibly holistic. And I basically found when I was writing it that I couldn't do everything. It would have been a volume of 1,000 pages. It would have just been completely unwieldy, or a multi-volume set. And so I thought I'd start off by really focusing on the Jewish women who were doing something that was very radical in terms of this community of men and women living together, living the life of philosophy in Alexandria. And then I would, and then I drew in the Greco-Roman background, really to explain why Philo was so careful about how he presented the women of this group. Because for Philo, first century Jewish philosopher, extremely intellectual, elite, rich, working in the Greco-Roman world, he wanted to present the women in a positive way, but he knew that they could easily be criticized in various different ways. So I was interested in that, but I have always wanted to draw this back into Christianity, which is where I really started off in terms of my own intellectual journey, and I'm doing that now. In fact, this is my current work. I'm I'm doing a very short introduction to Mary Magdalene for the Oxford
Fantastic.
series, yes, and also writing with Helen Bond, a book, Women Remembered, coming out with Hodder and Stoughton, Jesus' Female Disciples, and that will be coming out in Easter. So that's for a general audience. It's not a super academic book, but it allows me to get back into the Christian context, and also as something more academic, I have edited a volume on patterns of women's leadership in early Christianity with Ilaria Romelli, an Italian scholar. So I am moving back into Christianity, and I think it is all incredibly related.
Yes.
But in this book from 2003, it was very much focused on the radical elements of the Jewish world.
Okay, thank you. That explains to me a lot, actually, because when I was reading your book, Jewish Women Philosophers of the First Century Alexandria, I saw there's lots of also classical background, and I thought, oh, like it's not only this, right? Like there's lots of other women philosophers that are mentioned, but I was really fascinated with Therapethy, and just to repeat for our audience that Philo of Alexandria was like the philosopher in the first century, right? Especially in Alexandria. So what he said really matters. So it's interesting that he had to be really careful because of this, background in ancient Greece, right? When women were framed in one particular way, right? So
exactly. And it's for us, we think, oh, women in ancient philosophy, what a wonderful thing. There's Theano, there's Aspasia, there's Diotima, all of these great women working in philosophy. But actually, the way they're presented, because of the pitfalls of stepping out of line as a woman, that they can be presented in these ways where they can either be very positive figures or negative figures. And when they're presented by men as positive figures, they have to be controlled. They have to be, okay, yes, she was a philosopher, but she was very domestic and she was very modest. She was doing all the right things. Or, well, she was really one of the guys. She was her father's daughter. Her father had properly trained her. And so they have to be contained in these in appropriate ways for women's behavior in terms of the ancient world. And this is where I think it impacts on how women in Judaism, women in Christianity are being presented, because they knew these models too. It was very easy to be criticized if you were an intellectual woman.
That's right. I don't understand why intellectual woman was such a wild idea for them, because obviously, as you said, they have to either limit it or one of the men, basically, and maybe later we can discuss Hypatia, of course, and other women, but also, if they were not attached to someone or they had a relationship with someone else, they were framed as heteri, which is basically, the more classic form of prostitute who is also educated, right?
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the most prominent paradigms, that if you were an intellectual woman, if you wanted to engage with philosophy and really think about ethics and, or poetry, literature, anything, then you were immodest. And if you were immodest, well, you were probably having it off with one of the philosophers that you were working with. And therefore you were a courtesan, a prostitute.
Yeah, so they were always framed. So either they were completely desexualized, like Hypatia, who is, even I read stories, she was telling men, I'm really a man, right? Like when men were falling in love with her, like, look at this, being a woman is being disgusted and disgusting. And, I think you know what I'm referring to.
Yes.
Or if, they wanted to claim, their sexuality or just their femininity, then they were framed in extreme sexual terms in a negative way, basically as prostitutes. Yes. And I think, we can agree probably, I would just digress here, that my argument, which is obviously many other people's argument as well, but Mary Magdalene is also framed like that, as a prostitute.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So the way Mary Magdalene is presented as time goes by, the early Christians were steeped in the classical tradition. So if you've got, say, someone like Leontium in the Epicurean garden, who was an active philosopher in the Epicurean philosophical tradition, she's presented as basically a courtesan. She's sleeping with everyone because, Epicureans, they're interested in pleasure anyway, so why wouldn't she be? But then, right from the very beginning with the earliest idea of a woman philosopher, Thargelia, there's this idea that she is a courtesan. So it's so associated with, courtesans, just to set the picture, in terms of the ancient Greek and Hellenistic world, men and women dined separately. It wasn't considered that it was appropriate for men and women to dine together in the home. The women and the children dined in the women's quarters, and the men dined in the men's quarters. And it was in the men's quarters that you would expect to have philosophical debate, education even. This is how it took place. But you could invite a courtesan, you could invite dancers, you could invite all sorts of entertainments for men into the men's section. And so this then developed into this idea that the courtesan could develop into a philosophical conversation partner as a way of pleasing men and engaging in men's conversation around the dinner table. So you get this paradigm of the pleasing courtesan woman who's also not only available for great conversation, but also for sexual interaction. And when you've got that kind of paradigm, and then you get early Christianity, and you get this description of, and there were women on the road with Jesus. There was Mary Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and there was Susanna and Joanna.
Yes.
And they were on the road with Jesus in Galilee, as Luke describes them in Luke chapter 8. All of these paradigms then start to kind of kick in, and so any reader would then think, what kind of women were these? Well, they're certainly not the domestic women. They're not the good women that Musonius Rufus advocated could do philosophy, as long as it was the woman's kind of philosophy.
A good
and
wife.
Had them at home. The good wife, and they did a special kind of womanly philosophy that meant they could look after their homes better. They were out of their homes. They were out on the road. So these women could not have been good in terms of the Greco-Roman ideal.
Yes. So I don't want to put you on spot here, but I got really annoyed with one other British scholar when I saw her on some documentary, when she was saying that, Mary Magdalene, and she's very popular, Mary Magdalene traveled with Jesus because, she was an elderly woman. So they have to, contributing, which it's possible, to his movement, but the only reason why she was traveling with him, because her assumption is that she was an elderly woman. So again, she had to be somehow desexualized.
Yes.
Now she couldn't, you know what I mean? Like she had to be they had to kind of cut off any possible connection of her being a normal woman who was, independent enough, because she was not, as far as we know, daughter, or unless we go to other traditions, right, with Mary, Bethany, and so on, traveling with Jesus, like Joanna, who was actually an aristocratic woman, right? I think she was the wife of Kuza. Kuza. So they had to make, and because he, in Gnostic sources especially, Jesus was referring a lot to Mary Magdalene. So then, they had to, modern scholars, even nowadays, have to say, but, she was an elderly woman, and I thought, like, how convenient, how convenient.
It's so interesting, isn't it? How people do that. And in fact, there's no indication of her age. She could have been anything from 14 to 65 or whatever. We don't know her age. But why go down that track to sort of make her safe? Because it's actually exactly the same thing that is playing in with these paradigms. And Philo does this absolutely explicitly in terms of his presentation of the therapeutai, the women therapeutai who are living together with men. He says, oh, men and women living together, all following this philosophical path, all composing music in their little huts and then coming together. And they're gathering together in this lovely assembly and they're hearing these discourses. But he said, oh, but the women, they're mostly aged virgins. They're mostly aged virgins. So he immediately goes, well, don't think of them as, young, sexy babes. No. They're mostly older and virginal. So he desexualizes them to make them not fall into this category of the courtesan. And they're very, very much not that. So don't give me any idea of that. So, but the mostly is very telling, and other scholars have picked this up too, because actually in saying mostly, you go, okay, well, what does mostly? 51%.
What does mostly mean? It's a little bit like another scholar, Jeff Kripal, when he talks about sexuality and celibacy, so and he discusses what, when you discuss closer what celibacy is, it's not what most people think at all, so in spiritual circles, it has a completely different interpretation. And here with respect to women in those days, and it's interesting that this now very well-known British scholar, she gets lots of attention because she does talk about Mary Magdalene, but she had to be an old woman, right? So she had to be an old woman. So again, she's kind of framing her in the same way that people frame intelligent women for ages now. So I just want to read here that also another philosopher from a second century, Clement of Alexandria, was saying that men and women share equally in perfection and are to receive the same instruction and the same discipline, but nobody follow through, interestingly,
Well, that's right. Clement was pretty good. I mean, Clement was a very spiritual man.
Yes.
And also following the Alexandrian tradition. He was following Philo and had this much more symbolic reading of Christianity. Clement is a fascinating.
I love Clement.
Early Christian scholar. He's really worth reading if people don't know Clement of Alexandria.
So if I stayed on my path, this is probably I would be doing, studying Clement. But the path that was offered to me was to translate the letters of, as a PhD, which I rejected for better or worse, of Saint Augustine of Hippo. And after that, I was just so tired of doing Latin all the time, and I thought, I need a break, I don't want to spend, next 7 years of my life or so translating Augustine's letters.
True.
But I'm not sure if it was such a great decision, but, it took me on a different path. And I just would like to bring another version, another paradigm or another framing of women, if they were intelligent and also, they may perhaps refuse to be desexualized, like Aspasia, for example, who was a partner also of Pericles, who was the ruler of Athens, right? The very famous ruler of Athens. And how she was demonized. So when the Athens lost the Peloponnesian War, they said, oh, she must have given him a terrible advice.
Well, this is it.
So,
it's always that the woman, she's nothing until the man falls from glory, and then was he listening to his wife too much? And that's Portia with Brutus as well, who is considered a philosophical woman.
Yes.
And so she was advising him too much, and all sorts of terrible things happened.
If he only didn't listen, to his woman, however smart she was, because clearly she couldn't be that smart, right? Because look at what happened afterwards, right?
Yeah.
So so it's very interesting. So I really appreciate work that you do, and I will go after your other books, and perhaps once again we can meet perhaps again, when your book the most recent book is out.
Oh,
And
that'd be great.
in my own way, in a very kind of popular way, I was trying to bring it to human consciousness in my own book, so because sometimes, I love scholarly books, and I sometimes think that, we have to make people aware of his books and simplify
Yeah,
certain things, because scholarly work is so important, but unfortunately very often it stays only within scholarly circles, and it takes ages, until it is popularized. And I wanted to popularize it, including your typology, in a respectful way, but like kind of easy to read way, so to speak,
thank you. That's fantastic.
for, for, for everybody. So I really appreciate work of women like yourself. And I think my last question for this particular podcast would be, was this journey, which is a very intellectual journey, and the journey that I probably would have taken myself, and I took it in a more alternative form, was it somehow also a spiritual journey for you? And there's no pressure to answer anything here. Just how was it for you? Because for me, it turned out to be a spiritual journey. What about you?
Yeah, I think that is important to recognize. We're all on a spiritual journey, whether we recognize it or not. And I think I started off in my studies being very aware that I was on a spiritual journey. And then you get absolutely into the intellectual side, just trying to find out stuff. But it does influence me, and it makes me think, where we're going, really in terms of spirituality now. And for myself, I've gone around a number of different Christian faith communities, and I think I'm very ecumenical, actually, and can go just about anywhere and go, okay, this is where they're coming from. And landed with the Quakers because that has the broadest understanding, I think, within the Christian tradition, and really is sort of on the edge of Christian tradition. And I think we are moving into a time where we really need to think again where we're going with our different spiritual traditions, and create something that is more universal. And because it's so important now, when people are so bogged down in a very consumerist, disengaged, materialist world that is out of touch with the environment and out of touch with our own spirituality, that we really think what is useful in terms of our tradition and bring that to the fore and leave maybe some other things behind.
I couldn't agree more. And this is what, I call in my book the goddess consciousness. Like we have to, because we are really focused on the very masculine form of consciousness, right? So I'm kind of getting Jungian here, with masculine and feminine. And I think that to really move forward, we actually have to include the feminine, not just because women's rights and, and it's important to recover women that, contributed philosophically and intellectually and spiritually, which is already very valuable, but also we have to develop this other form of consciousness to, in my opinion, to survive as species and as a civilization that is worth remembering for anybody, basically.
Yes, I totally agree.
Joan, how can our listeners connect with you after this podcast?
Well, they can write to me at my email at King's College London, where I'm Professor of Christian Origins and Second Temple Judaism. So you can Google me and find my email.
Fantastic. And of course, through your books. And I will leave a link to your books as well, because I think this is really important. Your work is really important that you're doing. So with this, unfortunately, we have to end our podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, sign into the Other Goddess podcast. You can find similar conversations on my YouTube channel, Dr. Joanna Kujawa, and consider buying my book, The Other Goddess, Mary Magdalene, The Goddesses of Eros and Secret Knowledge, and of course, all the books by Joan, and especially Jewish women-philosophers of first century Alexandria, which I read and highly recommend, but also the new books, and I'll definitely leave the links there. So thank you so much, Joan.
Thank you for having me. Great talking.
It was a great pleasure. Until next time.